In the winter of 1931, the busiest coffee port on Earth began destroying its own cargo. Not spoiled cargo, not contaminated cargo. Perfectly good harvest, millions of sacks of it shoveled into government furnaces built for exactly this purpose. On the docks of Santos, Brazil, when the furnaces couldn't keep up, workers loaded the sacks onto barges, hauled them past the harbor mouth, and dumped them into the Atlantic. When the ocean wasn't fast enough either, engineers mixed the beans with tar and paved highways with them. This went on for 13 years. By the time it stopped, Brazil had destroyed roughly 78 million bags of coffee, enough to supply every cup on the planet for years, while the Great Depression pushed millions of families toward starvation. At the center of it all, a small dark bean that kings had once banned on pain of death. A bean grown for 2 centuries by people who were never allowed to keep a single coin it earned. And now, the men who owned it were burning it, not despite its value, but to protect it. That was 1931. But the story of coffee starts more than 1,000 years earlier, in mountain forests where the trees still grow wild. And according to legend, it starts with a herd of dancing goats. The legend goes like this. Around the year 850, an Ethiopian goatherd named Kaldi noticed his animals skipping and bleating through the night after chewing the red cherries of a certain mountain shrub. He tried them himself. A monk saw him, disapproved, threw the cherries on a fire, and the smell rising from those roasting seeds changed the world. It's a wonderful story. It was also first written down in 1671, more than 800 years after it supposedly happened. Most historians treat Kaldi as marketing, invented long after the fact, though some argue the tale preserves a genuine scrap of Ethiopian oral tradition. Either way, the forests are real. Coffea arabica grows wild in the Ethiopian highlands to this day, and the people there were chewing and brewing it long before anyone wrote anything down. The first solid evidence of coffee drinking comes from somewhere else across the Red Sea, in Yemen, in the middle of the 1400s. Sufi monks brewed a dark liquid they called kawa to stay awake through their night prayers. It worked. Word spread from the monasteries to the streets, and within a couple of generations, a scrubby port town on the Red Sea coast became the center of a brand new global trade. The town's name was Al-Makka. You know it as mocha, the word still printed on coffee menus 500 years later. Yemen understood exactly what it was sitting on, and it made a decision that would shape the next 2 centuries. Nobody else, anywhere on Earth, would ever be allowed to grow this plant. Every bean that left Yemen was boiled or part roasted first, so it could never germinate. Taking a live coffee plant out of the country was forbidden. 500 years before anyone coined the term, Yemen had invented agricultural protectionism, a monopoly enforced at the dockside, bean by bean. And the monopoly made coffee precious enough to frighten governments. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, a man named Kher Beg, shut down the city's coffee houses entirely. His reasoning had nothing to do with health. Men were gathering in those rooms, talking late into the night, unsupervised. Coffee, he decided, bred sedition. Higher authorities in Cairo overturned the ban, but the pattern was set. A century later, the fear reached its peak. In 1633, the Ottoman Sultan Murad IV banned coffee in Istanbul under penalty of death. Not a fine, not a lashing. Death, contemporary accounts say he patrolled the streets in disguise, personally catching subjects in the act of drinking a beverage. Think about what that means. One of the most powerful empires in history was executing its own people over a hot drink, because the rooms where people drank it were the rooms where they compared grievances, shared news, and plotted. Every ruler who banned coffee understood something we've mostly forgotten. Coffee was never just a stimulant. It was infrastructure for conversation. And conversation is dangerous. For 200 years, the monopoly held. Then, it was broken, not by an army, not by a navy, but by a pilgrim walking out of Mecca with 7 seeds strapped to his body. His name was Baba Budan, a Sufi pilgrim from southern India, and around 1670 he smuggled 7 fertile coffee seeds out of Yemen. Tradition says taped flat against his stomach where customs men wouldn't search a holy man. He planted them in the hills of Mysore. Coffee grows in India still, on hillsides that carry his name. Once the wall was breached, the professionals moved in. By the 1690s, the Dutch East India Company had live coffee plants growing on Java, worked by forced local labor, the first true colonial coffee plantations. A descendant of those plants was nurtured in Amsterdam's botanical garden like a crown jewel, and in 1714, Amsterdam's burghers made a diplomatic gift of one seedling to Louis Sive of France. From the royal greenhouse in Paris, that plant's offspring made one of history's strangest ocean crossings. In 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu carried a seedling toward Martinique in a glass case. The ship was becalmed for weeks, and drinking water ran so short, it was rationed. In a letter he wrote decades later, in 1774, de Clieu describes what he did next. He split his own water ration with the plant, cup by cup, day after day. His personal sacrifice, his own account of it survives, became the ancestor of millions of coffee trees across the Caribbean. 4 years after de Clieu, in 1727, a Portuguese-Brazilian officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta was sent to French Guiana to mediate a border dispute. The story goes that he charmed the French governor's wife, and at his farewell dinner she handed him a bouquet with fertile coffee seeds hidden inside. Historians can't verify the romance. What's documented is that Brazil's first coffee arrived from French Guiana in the 1720s. From that handful of contraband, Brazil would one day grow more coffee than the rest of the world combined. Coffee had escaped its cage. And back in Europe, the drink was starting riots of its own while quietly building, in smoky back rooms, the machinery of modern money. In December 1675, King Charles II of England issued a proclamation closing every coffeehouse in the kingdom. These were, in his words, places where the disaffected met to spread scandalous reports about the government. He was right, that's exactly what they were. The ban lasted 11 days. Public fury was so immediate, so universal, that one of Europe's monarchs surrendered to his own subjects in under 2 weeks over coffee. The year before, London had produced one of the strangest documents of the century, the Women's Petition Against Coffee, a satirical pamphlet complaining that the drink was making England's men as unfruitful as the deserts the berry came from. Coffee panic wasn't an Ottoman quirk. It followed the bean everywhere. Prussia tried money instead of morals. In 1777, Frederick the Great declared beer the true patriotic drink. Coffee imports were draining Prussian silver into foreign pockets and licensed a corps of Kaffeeschniffler, coffee sniffers, mostly disabled veterans who walked the streets literally smelling the air for illegal roasting. None of it worked because the coffeehouse had become something no government could replace. A penny bought you a cup and a seat, and with it, the day's news, shipping reports, gossip, and argument. Londoners called them penny universities. In Exchange Alley, stock jobbers priced shares at Jonathan's Coffee House. That room grew into the London Stock Exchange. Merchants insuring ships gathered at Edward Lloyd's Coffee House from the 1680s. Today, that's Lloyd's of London. In New York, traders did business at the Tontine Coffee House from 1793, an early home of what became the New York Stock Exchange. Modern finance wasn't born in a bank, it was born at a coffee counter. You've probably heard the famous line that coffee became the world's second most traded commodity after oil. It's repeated in books, in TED Talks, everywhere. It's false, a myth traced to a misreading of 1970s trade statistics, and by actual value, it isn't close. Coffee never needed the fake statistic. What it built in those rooms, the exchanges, the insurance markets, the newspapers, is more impressive than the myth. Though historians still argue about the drink itself, one school says the caffeine mattered, a sober stimulant replacing daytime beer. Skeptics answer that the institution mattered, not the chemistry. Both agree on where the deals got done. But every pot poured in those brilliant, argumentative rooms was brewed from beans cut an ocean away by hands that would never be free. and would never hold a coin of the money moving across those trading floors. By 1789, one French colony on the island of Hispaniola Saint-Domingue produced roughly half of all the coffee on Earth, along with about 40% of its sugar. It did this with the labor of around 500,000 enslaved people worked under conditions so lethal that the colony's population could not sustain itself. The plantations didn't just use the Atlantic slave trade. They required it, continuously, to replace the people they consumed. The planters built townhouses in Bordeaux and Nantes. The people who picked the coffee were buried without names. In 1791, Saint-Domingue rose. It became the only successful slave revolution in recorded history, and the coffee estates of the northern plain were among the first things to burn. When Haiti declared independence in 1804, the world's largest coffee producer effectively left the market overnight. The trade's answer was not to reconsider. It was to relocate. Production surged into Cuba and, above all, into Brazil, and Brazil scaled the system beyond anything the Caribbean had seen. Over the course of the Atlantic trade, Brazil imported roughly 9 million enslaved Africans, about 40% of everyone taken. Through the 1800s, coffee replaced sugar as the empire's engine, and the coffee barons of the Paraíba Valley measured their fortunes in human beings. Brazilians of the era had a saying about their most famous export: coffee was made with the blood of the enslaved. Their words, not history's afterthought. Brazil held on longer than anyone. It became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, the Golden Law, May 13, 1888, and it took that long largely because the coffee planters fought abolition to the end. Even then, the ledger barely changed shape. Planters replaced enslaved labor with poor European immigrants on subsidized contracts, the colono system, many of them bound to the estates by debts they couldn't clear. And while Brazil was swallowing the world market, the era delivered a warning almost nobody heeded. In 1869, a rust-colored fungus appeared on coffee leaves in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, then one of the great coffee islands. Within about 20 years, Himalaya vastatrix had annihilated the island's entire coffee industry. One organism, one monoculture, total economic extinction. Ceylon survived by ripping out coffee and planting tea, which is the only reason the word Ceylon means tea to you today. By the 20th century, Brazil grew most of the coffee on Earth, which handed Brazil a problem no producer had ever faced at such scale. What do you do when you grow far, far too much of it? Here's the trap Brazil built for itself. Coffee trees take years to mature, so every price boom triggered planting frenzies that arrived as crushing surpluses half a decade later. From the early 1900s, the government tried valorization, buying up surplus harvests and warehousing them to hold prices up. It worked just well enough to encourage even more planting. Then October 1929 happened. Demand collapsed with the world economy, warehouses were already bursting, and the new government of Getulio Vargas faced mountains of coffee that could not be sold at any acceptable price. The National Coffee Department reached for the furnace. Between 1931 and 1944, Brazil destroyed roughly 78 million bags of coffee. It's a number so large it slides off the mind. So hold it still for a second. At 60 kilograms a bag, that's nearly 5 million tons of coffee years of the entire planet's consumption burned in purpose-built incinerators, sunk in the sea, blended into road tar. Photographs from Santos show coffee piled like coal beside the furnaces. All of it destroyed for one reason: scarcity is worth money, and abundance was ruin. The Depression-era world watched food burn while breadlines lengthened. The price floor held more or less, and the plantation owners survived. The workers who carried the sacks to the fires were paid pennies to destroy more wealth in a day than they would earn in a lifetime. One corporation saw the mountain of unsellable beans and had a different idea. Brazil's coffee authorities had been pressing Nestle to find some industrial use for the surplus, and in 1938 the company answered: a soluble powder called Nescafé. Instant coffee was born not from convenience culture, but from catastrophe, a way to monetize a fire sale. The Second World War finished the job. Nescafé went into American ration kits by the millions, and soldiers carried the habit to every continent and brought it home again. The war ended. The surplus problem didn't. So the world's coffee powers eventually tried something almost no commodity had ever been granted: a legal global cartel with the United States as a signatory. In 1962, producing and consuming nations signed the International Coffee Agreement, a treaty that fixed export quotas and propped up prices worldwide. Why would Washington, the world's biggest coffee buyer, sign a deal to make its own coffee more expensive? Look at the date. 3 years after the Cuban Revolution, the United States was buying insurance. Stable coffee prices meant stable rural incomes across Latin America, and stable rural incomes meant fewer peasants listening to Havana. For 27 years, the quota system held prices in a managed band. Coffee was, quite literally, a Cold War weapon, one you could drink. Then, the Cold War ended, and so did the insurance policy. In 1989, the agreement collapsed when the quota system broke down and Washington walked away. Prices fell off a cliff. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the crash deepened into what the industry simply calls the coffee crisis. By 2001 and 2002, the benchmark price had sunk below 50 cents a pound, beneath the cost of production for millions of farming families. In the highlands of Central America and Ethiopia, the result was hunger, abandoned farms, and a generation walking off the land toward cities and borders. At the same moment, a new giant arrived to keep prices down. Vietnam, rebuilding its economy after the 1986 IME reforms, went from marginal producer to the world's number 2 almost within a decade, a flood of cheap Robusta that permanently redrew the market. Prices did eventually recover. But notice who was setting them at every step of this story: sultans, kings, colonial companies, price boards, treaty negotiators, futures traders. Almost none of them ever grew a coffee tree. So who grows your coffee now? Mostly very small farmers, roughly 25 million smallholder families worldwide, most tending plots of a few acres, many earning less from a year's harvest than a barista earns in a month. Run the math on a $5 latte. The farmer who grew the beans in it typically captures somewhere between 1 and 3% of that price, a few cents. The rest disperses into shipping, roasting, real estate, branding, and milk. Brazil still grows more than a third of the world's coffee, Vietnam close to a fifth, but the countries that grow it capture a sliver of what you pay, and the individual growers capture a sliver of the sliver. This is the quiet inheritance of everything you've watched so far. The plantation system ended, the price structure it built, value flowing away from the people at the roots of the tree, never really did. The names changed. The ledger didn't. And then, just as the industry settled into that comfortable arithmetic, the weather began doing what no sultan, cartel, or treaty had ever managed. It took control of the supply. Arabica, still the backbone of everything worth drinking, is a genetically narrow, ecologically fussy crop that wants cool tropical mountainsides in a world that is running out of them. Peer-reviewed projections estimate that roughly half of the land currently suitable for Arabica could be unsuitable by 2050. If that sounds abstract, remember Ceylon, a single vulnerability, a monoculture, and 20 years from dominance to zero. We are running that experiment again at planetary scale, and this time the fungus is the climate itself. The market has already felt the first tremors. After Brazil's worst drought on record and a Vietnamese harvest down by roughly a fifth, Arabica futures did something in late 2024 and early 2025 they had never done before. They broke the all-time record that had stood since 1977, peaking above $4 a pound. By spring 2026, Consumer Reports were tallying retail coffee prices up as much as 106%. And the whiplash hasn't stopped. In late June 2026, days ago, as this video is made, Arabica futures jumped to nearly $2.96, a 4.5-month high after freak rains hit Minas Gerais, Brazil's biggest growing region, at 19 times the historical weekly average and stalled the harvest. Exchange-certified stockpiles sank to their lowest level since March 2024. And yet, in the same month, the U.S. Department of Agriculture forecast Brazil's next crop as the largest in its history, nearly 72 million bags. Too little coffee and too much coffee, at the same time, in the same market. Santos in 1931 was the problem of abundance. This is both problems at once, and the price of your morning cup now swings on a single week of weather in one Brazilian state. 1,000 years of this story, and it has never once been about the bean. It has always been about the lever. Tomorrow morning, the smell of coffee will fill your kitchen the way it filled a Sufi monastery in Yemen 6 centuries ago. The bean in your cup is nearly identical, genetically, to the trees Ceylon lost in 1869. A few cents of what you paid for it will reach the family who grew it. Coffee has never really been priced by how hard it is to grow. It's priced by who controls the supply, and for 1,000 years, the people who actually grow it have been the last ones allowed a hand on that lever. Remember Santos in 1931? The year coffee was so worthless they paved roads with it, and so precious they burned it to keep its price alive. Both things were true at once. In this trade, they usually are. That's the bitter yield.